Airplane pilots. What's the scariest close call you had that passengers never noticed? Story 1. This was about 7 years ago now. I took my brother and 2 cousins up for a short sightseeing flight one morning in a Cessna 172. I knew there was some weather coming in, so I wanted to get it over with quickly. About 20 minutes in, I noticed the clouds getting worse and then some lightning off in the distance. Definitely time to head back. Heading back, I radioed my intentions to the uncontrolled airport, which had an FBO, and someone radioed back with the current winds. What they said didn't compute, and in retrospect, I should have asked for clarification. When I got back to the airport and was on final approach, I realized just how bad the wind was. I was having a hard time keeping on centerline and eventually went around on the first attempt. By now, I was starting to sweat bullets and was planning on rerouting if the next attempt didn't go well. I made sure to turn the intercom off so my cousins in the back couldn't hear how panicked I was becoming, though I did keep my cool throughout the whole thing. On the second attempt, I had the rudder pegged to the left and managed to get the wheels on the ground safely. I taxied to park, shut down, jumped out, and started shaking with adrenaline before letting out a huge sigh of relief. My cousins had no idea what had just happened. It was just an exciting flight to them. My brother kind of knew what was going on, and I filled him in on what I was thinking later. Apparently, I had an audience of guys from the FBO watching me as well, probably yelling at me to go somewhere else. I'm honestly surprised sometimes that I managed that landing without incident, especially since that was basically my first crosswind landing. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. I made an uncoordinated turn and all the fuel went to one side of the plane, which choked both engines. They sputtered and cut out. We were at 3,000 feet, so I brought back coordination and pointed the nose down a bit. The engines started back up. Yikes! Edit, here are some clarifying points. I'm not an airline pilot. I'm an aerial photo pilot. I had one passenger, the camera operator, and he didn't notice, but to be fair, he was pretty absorbed in his podcast. The uncoordinated turn was intentional. We use skidding turns to execute 180-degree turns faster so we can stay online and collect more pictures. It was a light twin, and we were low on fuel, which is what enabled the airplane to experience fuel starvation. Under normal fuel circumstances, this wouldn't have happened. Story 3. Once, while departing Burning Man in a private plane with a couple of passengers, my engine conked out. I didn't even follow the engine out checklist. I glanced at the fuel pressure gauge, didn't like what I saw, hit the switch for the auxiliary fuel pump, and the engine came back to life. The whole incident was over so fast that the passengers never even noticed. I wouldn't call it a we're all screwed moment, though. In the worst-case scenario, I would have had to set it back down on the playa, which offers pretty flat terrain as far as the eye can see. Story 4. I was in the process of getting my PPL private pilot license and was flying circuits solo. Before I took off, the CFO of the flight school asked me if I was sure it was a good idea to fly. It's pretty windy. I was flying a Cessna 152 on a day with winds pushing 15 knots and turbulence around 20. I honestly don't know what I or anyone at the flight school was thinking, letting me a 16-year-old take off. Anyway, a few bumpy circuits went by with no problem. I actually got some great practice landing in turbulence, so on the last circuit of the day, I'm on final with full flaps, doing the absolute minimum speed for approach in a 152, not taking into consideration that the air was super turbulent. For those who don't know, when it's bumpy, you should be going a little faster on approach than usual. I was quite close to the ground, maybe 300-400 feet, and I could hear the wind blowing over the sound of the engine. Suddenly, no wind. I had just lost 15-20 knots of almost direct headwind on final approach, with absolutely no airspeed to spare. I remember my shirt sleeves looked like they were inflating, and the plane's stall warning started screaming at me. The controls became totally useless, like a limp computer joystick. Thankfully, I had my hand on the throttle like my instructor had taught me, and for whatever instinctual reason, good instructor probably, I gently pushed the throttle all the way forward and slightly lowered the nose. All of this took place in the span of about 5 seconds. I remember what I did, but not thinking about doing it. It was like when you drive somewhere and suddenly realize you've arrived without remembering the drive. Damn scary. I landed the plane just fine and went home to take a nap. My parents said I was pale as a ghost when I got home. Flying is fun until it isn't. Edit? A lot of people are wondering why I gently pushed the throttle forward. The reason is that the carburetor can't provide enough fuel to maintain the proper fuel-air mixture. When a pilot rapidly pushes the throttle forward, the carburetor is supposed to provide a quick squirt of fuel to account for the rapid increase in air. If the pilot slams the throttle to the firewall, the huge amount of air coming into the carburetor is simply too much for it to maintain the proper air-fuel mixture, even with the extra squirt. In the best case, this can cause the engine to lag for a few seconds while the mixture catches up, and in the worst case, it might actually cause the engine to stall completely. So imagine an inexperienced pilot who panics and really jams the throttle all the way forward. That could have a disastrous effect because not only are they at low altitude with little airspeed, but they've just choked their engine and simply can't get more power. Story 5. I'm a relatively new student pilot, and I was just starting to practice pattern work by myself. However, my instructor either wanted me to go up with him for a few laps before soloing or fly with another instructor if he had other students. So when my instructor had another student he was teaching, I ended up going up with a different instructor just to verify that little 10-hour me could still fly a plane before practicing for an hour or two. We took off, and as I was on final for our last practice run, it was a little shaky as it usually is in the mid-afternoon in Florida, but I was confident in my ability to land the plane. Well, to my surprise, when I was about maybe 100 feet above the runway, the plane just dropped in an instant, like someone had taken their hand and just pushed it down. Luckily, my instructor must have trained me well, because like you, I had my hand on the throttle and just gently pushed the power to full, leveled the nose, and made a smooth go-around. It made me feel good knowing that my brain knew what to do without having to think about it much. Also, the instructor I was with always seemed to look a bit angry, but I was pleasantly surprised when he smiled and complimented me on my quick decision-making. Getting a compliment for doing something specifically well, other than just, "good job today," really boosted my confidence as a new student. It wasn't necessarily a situation where I was thinking, "oh shit, we could have died," but knowing that I'm capable of recovering from a scenario like that and not ending up like the guy who slammed a plane onto the runway and broke the gear felt reassuring. I still hear about that landing gear incident, and it's been months. Story 6. This entire story occurred in less than 10 seconds and should have ended with headlines on CNN. I was a military pilot, not commercial, but it still could have ended in disaster. I was flying a CH-47D Chinook helicopter in Iraq in mid-July 2008 when the temperature was over 130 degrees. The aircraft was packed full with 36 passengers at an altitude of only 100 feet and a speed of 140 knots, lower and faster than you'd ever fly in the US. We hit a thermal pocket of warm air that pushed us up, so I nosed the cyclic, which looks like a joystick between your legs, forward to maintain altitude. I was a brand new pilot flying with a combat veteran who wanted me to maintain an altitude of 100 feet, almost exactly, no higher than 120 or lower than 80 feet. Nosing the aircraft down kept us from going higher, but we immediately hit a downdraft, and the aircraft started to fall like a rock. I pulled back on the cyclic as hard as I could to get the nose up, but it hit my body armor and wouldn't go back any further. I watched the altimeter drop all the way to 19 feet. Miraculously, we stopped falling and began to climb at the last possible second. During the debrief, the other pilot, now one of my closest friends, who had well over 1,000 combat hours, told me he had never been so close to dying before. I wasn't shaken up until I heard that even typing this today gives me chills. Story 7. Not completely on topic, but I was an aircraft mechanic for the Navy back in the day working on A-4 Skyhawks. A student pilot noticed his canopy light was on, indicating his canopy wasn't all the way closed and locked. He decided it might help if he cracked the canopy open just a little bit and closed it again. I remember seeing it land as a convertible. We sent a couple of guys out in a pickup truck, and they found the missing canopy in a farmer's field. Story 8. Mine is from many years ago, when I was a student pilot. I was 14, I think, at the time. I had about 15 hours logged and was getting close to soloing for the first time, but I still had a few more hours and landings to practice. I was doing some basics and getting ready to come back with my instructor to practice some touch and goes for a bit. Coming back through, we had to pass through DTW's Bravo airspace, which means you need permission to go through it. A few minutes before I was about to call for permission, my instructor got really quiet. I looked over at him, and he looked really bad. I thought he was going to throw up, so I started looking for a bag. But then I noticed he wasn't breathing. I figured out where I was and called up DTW approach. I declared a medical emergency and told them that my instructor was not breathing. I also told them I was a student who had never landed on my own before, and never at a large airport. Detroit approach was amazing at helping me. They gave me an option for DTW or Willow Run, but Willow would have added a good 5 to 10 minutes since I was coming in from the southeast. I opted for DTW, and they were great at giving me vectors while also getting the big jets out of the way. I remember hearing them tell several planes to go around and put several more into holding patterns. Anyway, I did my approach and made the most butter-smooth landing I have ever made in my life, even to this day. The ambulance was right there on the taxiway waiting for me. It turns out my instructor, who was only 25, had had a heart attack. He ended up being okay. All in all, from first call to him being in the ambulance was less than 10 minutes, thanks to ATC and DTW Tower. Story 9. Not a pilot, but a passenger. I was on a 16-seater turboprop when suddenly there was a loud bang. All the lights went out and we dropped. We were all looking around like, what's going on? Is this how we die? After a few minutes, the lights came back on and the pilot came on the PA. He said, "Sorry about that, folks, but we were just struck by lightning. No need to worry. Everything seems to be working, except for the radar. It's fried." I may have worried a little. Story 10. I was learning to fly when I worked for the government. On my first flight with me taking off, we had been climbing for about 5 minutes and were going through some gentle turns when my instructor said, "We're going to head back, I don't feel well." He took over the stick and he looked ashen. He then started to breathe erratically and said I needed to help him control the plane. He radioed the tower, and up until now I was thinking it was a prank. Mayday, mayday. He talked me through the whole thing while I was trying to talk to the tower, repeat information, read gauges, remember lessons, listen to him, and hope he wouldn't pass out. I was shitting myself. Takeoff is one thing, but landing? We landed like a kangaroo with a rocket up its behind. I'm surprised the wheels didn't fold. There must have been 4 big bounces, but it was a big runway. We scrubbed speed, finally got the plane to stop, and my instructor passed out. He had had a heart attack. He survived, but only for a few months before I heard he passed away in his sleep. But he got us down. Story 11. I'm a CFI at this point, and I'm flying with a student. We see a spider in the cockpit. I'm okay with spiders, but I don't want it distracting the student, so I squash it. The student missed the spider but saw my movement and asked what it was. I responded, "It was a spider, I killed it." As I glanced into the back seat area, I managed to casually add, "Why? Are you scared of spiders?" without the student noticing the break in the sentence. Turns out the student is scared of spiders. For the rest of that flight, I squished spiders behind my student's back as they came forward from the nest I had just spotted in the back of the plane. He never knew. Story 12. Not a pilot, but my buddy has a private license, and we fly together often, just so he can build hours. I buy lunch, he gets hours. It's fun. I live in the PNW and wanted to fly over Crater Lake one winter. The ceiling was 8,000 feet. Crater Lake sits at 6,000 feet. He doesn't have his instrument rating yet, so we can't break the ceiling. We fly over, have an easy time, take great pics, etc. We get back to the airport, go to the bar, and he proceeds to tell me that was the most frightened he's ever been while piloting. Why? The single-engine Cessna we were in could glide 2 to 3 miles in an emergency. Crater Lake is 8+ miles in diameter. In the middle, we'd be screwed. I asked him what he would do. He said, "I'd nosedive into the water. You want to swim in that lake and drown, or die quick and mostly painless?" FML. Story 13. My friend's girlfriend is a flight attendant, and on one trip, they ran out of alcohol. They were worried people would get mad or freak out because some passengers heavily rely on alcohol to help with their flying nerves, but none of the passengers noticed. After they served the last drink, nobody ordered anything else. It's not a crazy life or death scenario, but I thought it was an amusing anecdote about the passengers not realizing what had happened. Story 14. There's never been a moment like this for me because you're always trying something else to save the plane. There's never been a real situation where I had to save a plane from imminent disaster. There have been decisions I've had to make where, if I chose wrong, we could be in a bad spot, but never anything like we're all going to die. Once, when landing an RJ on a short runway out in the Northeast, I was carrying a little too much speed and caught a gust at the wrong moment during the landing flare. The plane lifted maybe 10 feet higher, and I slowly lowered the nose. I realized at that moment that where the plane would touch down would not give me a whole lot of opportunity to stop before the end of the runway. As a matter of fact, it probably wasn't going to stop until we got into the trees at the end. I pushed the power up and we did a go-around maybe 20-30 feet off the ground. The controllers vectored us around and we landed safely on try number 2. In the simulator, we do all the oh crap stuff, and even when a training event goes sideways, we still try to fly the thing until it hits something solid. I can't imagine ever giving up on the plane in flight. There are thousands of decisions made every day on flights by pilots that prevent a difficult situation from becoming dangerous. Flying these days is very cautious and conservative. Safety is always first, and nothing is ever allowed to slide. Story 15. Not quite with passengers, but tip few nonetheless. During my first solo flight ever, I was really excited and wanted to video record the special occasion. So there I was, taxiing down the taxiway with one hand holding my phone. One thing about old propeller planes is that they're just like old cars and don't always track straight. I suppose I was a little too concentrated on making sure my camera was properly angled and focused. Next thing I knew, my plane had rolled off the asphalt into the grassy ditch. I panicked. How the hell was I supposed to get this plane out of there? Over the radio, there was silence, as the controller likely saw what happened from the tower. After a few seconds, probably still speechless at this point, she casually checked on me to make sure I was doing okay. To save my embarrassment, I tried to power up and taxi out of the grass back to the asphalt. Much to my surprise, it worked. I did my short flight as planned and returned to the hangar where my instructor was waiting. I have no idea how many people saw what happened, but from the look on his face, I'm pretty sure he knew too. And yes, that video of me taxiing a plane into a ditch still exists somewhere. I suppose this is the airplane equivalent of don't text and drive. Story 16. When I was younger, I was with my dad, who pilots a small plane. We were mid-flight when the engine just started slowing down, and the plane started descending crazy fast. It somehow picked up again before hitting the ground. Mind you, this happened in under a minute. I didn't panic or anything because I had no idea what the hell was going on. I was like 3-4, so I only realized in hindsight what had actually happened. Story 17. I wasn't the pilot, but I was a passenger on a glider. For those who don't know, gliders cannot get off the ground on their own. For this glider, we needed a tow plane, a 172. The 172 has a tow hook that they clip into our nose. When we want to release, we go through a release procedure. The pilot in the 172 dips a wing to signal the release, slows down, and we dive. This creates slack, we nose up, then release the tow cable. The Cessna flies on its merry way, and we glide. Well, during the release procedure, something went wrong, and the cable could not be released. The glider pulled on the tail of the Cessna and caused a ton of chaos, as flying a 172 with a glider that isn't synced with your motions is incredibly hard. Luckily, we both made it back in one piece, but that could very well have caused the 172 to stall and crash, and we would have been dragged down with them, watching helplessly. Story 18. The only example I can think of where several people messed up and passengers didn't notice, a friend of mine took the wrong airplane. The aircraft was parked, fueled, and boarded correctly, but it was the wrong tail number. He actually did have an aha moment while taxiing out, so he called dispatch and requested an amended release for the tail he was about to fly. But then he took off before receiving the amended release, so that got him a review board. He had screwed up a few other things recently too, regarding international paperwork, so he was downgraded to the right seat for a time. The passengers didn't know. It could have been my story, but every time I sat down in the cockpit, I checked the tail number against the release. In one case where there was a mismatch, the passengers did notice because the aircraft had to be swapped at the gate, causing a delay. Story 19. Long time ago, back in 1989, I was a first officer on the 747-100. We pushed back from the terminal in Anchorage and taxied out for a departure to Narita, Tokyo. We were full of people and very close to max takeoff weight. At the end of the runway, it was my takeoff. I stood on the brakes, stood the thrust levers up, and the engineer set full takeoff power. I released the brakes, and off we went. And we rolled and rolled and rolled down the runway. It was not sparkling acceleration by any means. As the end of the runway loomed into sight and takeoff speed was still some distance away, with the lights going red, white, red, white, red, 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 the captain said, and I quote, "Best you rotate." We were a good 20 knots below VR. Not being a complete fool, I slowly and smoothly rotated, and the beast flew away off the end of the runway like a lady. We slowly climbed away, cleaned up, turned, and headed out west. Not a word was said for a long while. Finally, through 20,000 feet, the engineer launched himself at my performance figures. Nothing was wrong, and we were at full power anyway. It turned out that extra cargo had been loaded in error, and we were well overweight. Apart from me having a moment of panic and a raised heart rate, the passengers were none the wiser. Story 20. Passenger here. There was once when I was little, we landed and the pilots told us to put down our window shades to keep the plane cool. They were pretty insistent. Being a kid, I kept mine open a bit to peek out and saw after a little while that we were taxiing backwards. I don't know what happened, but I think they didn't want us to know they had made a wrong turn or something. Story 21. I'm a commercial helicopter pilot. Probably the closest moment to we're screwed I ever had was a few years ago. To set it up, I was ferrying a helicopter by myself to another location about 200 miles away. The helicopter I was flying was set up for IFR instrument flying, and I'm a fairly experienced IFR captain. The helicopter I was in does not like ice. That means flying in the clouds when it's below freezing is basically impossible. This was in the high Arctic in early spring, so it was basically always cold. The weather wasn't great, but I still wanted to give the trip a shot. If it was bad, I would just turn around and come home. About 50 miles out, the cloud ceiling was coming down and visibility was dropping. I was over a small frozen lake, and I could see at the other end of the lake that the clouds were right down to the ground. At this point, I was at about 300 feet above ground. I made the call to turn around and started a left-hand turn, but as I was halfway through the turn, I entered cloud. Under normal circumstances, a VFR helicopter unintentionally entering cloud is often a death sentence, but I'm a trained IFR pilot in an IFR helicopter. I started a climb as I knew there was rising terrain on the side of the lake. I don't mind flying in cloud. What I do mind is the fact that my helicopter started icing up instantly. I'm not talking about a bit of ice. I'm talking about a massive amount of ice in a helicopter that doesn't like any ice. There was no way I could make it the 50 miles back to the airport to shoot an IFR approach, and I knew the clouds were too thick to climb above them. I also couldn't descend because the ceiling was so low that I risked impacting the terrain if I didn't pop out of the clouds soon enough. I was running through the options in my head, but my heart rate was going up. This isn't something that normally happens. I'm not the type of pilot who gets into situations that scare me. I was rapidly running out of time, so I headed to a larger flat area as indicated on my GPS and maps, set my radio altimeter, a device that tells you exactly how far above the ground you are, to beep at me when I reached 250 feet and started descending. I figured if I didn't break out by 300 feet, I was in some serious trouble. As I was approaching 300 feet, I broke out of cloud, good visibility, and a clear path all the way back to the airport. I did a normal approach and landing and shut down at our hangar. The blades were covered in ice. After I changed my underwear, we pulled the helicopter into the hangar to let the ice thaw. The next day, the weather was beautiful and the trip went off without a hitch. After flying for 10 years and thousands of hours, it was the only time I was actually scared. I'm glad I didn't have any passengers on board at the time. Story 22. I was a passenger on the plane. It was my first time flying alone, so it was a big deal for me. Chicago to Tampa, the weather was fine. The way back to Chicago? That was rough. It was a boring commercial flight. The plane wasn't completely full, but there were quite a few people still. We were approaching Midway Airport when something happened. There was a big bang and a huge sudden drop. The plane then jerked up and away, and for some reason we had to go to O'Hare instead. So we're over the lake and we're told to assume the crash position. I was 12. When the flight attendants were in their seats in the crash position, I knew it was bad. The whole time the plane was jerking and going up and down, weightless one moment and then a jerk back to normal feeling. We were so close to the water, I was just thinking that I wanted to see my family and everyone again. We were finally approaching O'Hare, and we saw fire trucks and ambulances by the airport. Watching that runway approaching so fast, and the captain came on and said to brace for a very hard impact. The wheels were stuck, I guess, so somehow we landed in a perfect glide without hitting anything. We did veer off across another runway and stopped in the grass. It was rough and bumpy, and the noise of metal against concrete was like nails on a chalkboard times a million. But the only real damage was whatever had failed and the belly of the plane being banged up. That's it. I was so far into fear that when I finally looked up, I saw the bins had opened and everything was everywhere. It was just silence. Then everyone was just cheering and hugging each other. The pilot came on and said, "Well, I think I give this roller coaster ride a 2, then in seriousness talked about the slides coming out and all that. We were all walking out and everyone was just shaking the pilot's hand. It was my turn, and I'm a hormonal, emotional 12-year-old, so I just hugged him and cried. I was so embarrassed after, but he was just happy because I was a kid and I was okay. Then I got to go down the slide. Whee! Not as fun as you think. Lol. After everyone was checked out by paramedics, we got taken to a gate. I was looking around for my dad since he was the one who was supposed to pick me up, and I heard him yelling my name, so I was screaming, "Daddy, Daddy!" Sigh, fiercest hug I ever got from him, and one of a handful of times I've seen him cry. He was doing that thing where parents just check you all over, arms, legs, okay, no blood, you okay, you okay? I was the only kid on the plane, so people were cheering and clapping during all of this. My dad found the pilot and shook his hand, thanking him. The pilot was just like, I was doing my job. My dad was like, "No, you do your job every day. Today you had to go above and beyond what your job usually requires of you." We were leaving, and my dad told me that when they had announced the emergency over the system at Midway Airport, he had never felt his heart drop so fast. This was back when you could meet people at the gate, so suddenly he said there were a bunch of people running. He took some other people with him because they had taken the bus to Midway. It's about a 45-minute drive from one airport to another. They were pulling in when the plane started to make its descent, so he pulled over and they watched it land. Obviously, they didn't know the condition of the inside of the plane, but they got hope then. Later, we got more details on what happened. A goose got sucked into the engine. Normally, it wouldn't have done anything, but it was like a series of freak incidents after it happened. I don't remember the technical details, but I guess another engine failed, and then the tail went awry. They were 100% sure we were going to crash into the lake. That's why he changed course. It was either a residential area and us, or just us. They had grounded all planes meant to take off from O'Hare, so I'm only assuming all eyes were on us from the tower. Somehow he managed to keep us high enough to avoid crashing. I don't know all of what he had to do, just that he should not have been able to make it. Holy crap. Sorry for the long post. P.S. My dad found out what he and his co-pilot were making in a year and wrote a check for that amount. My parents and my sister and I took them to dinner and gave them their checks. The main pilot and I kept in touch. He's like a third uncle. Story 23. I know this doesn't fit this thread at all, but I've been wanting to share this for years. It's actually quite the opposite in a lot of ways, but I'm telling it anyway. I was at work one day when this guy, known for telling great tales, called a girl at my work as he was leaving SXSW. He told her his plane might be going down. It spread like wildfire throughout the company, and I heard about it. So naturally I thought, yeah, right, and brought up his flight on FlightAware to see a really messed up flight pattern. Anyway, his story went like this. They were just taking off when the right engine disintegrated. The captain came on and said what had happened and that they needed to dump fuel and try to land. The try part came from the fact that they weren't sure if the engine had taken out the landing gear. At this point, everyone was panicking, and even the flight attendants were crying and freaking out. The captain came back on and said to assume crash positions, which is basically putting your head down and kissing your butt goodbye. They landed, and all was good. What I saw on FlightAware was a plane take off and circle like 8 times, then land. I couldn't imagine that, and I think about it every time I take off in a plane. The chaos and feelings my friend and everyone else must have felt must have been intense. It never made it on the news. It was never reported, which only makes you wonder, how often does stuff like that happen? Story 24. Obligatory disclaimer. I'm not an airline pilot, but I am a private pilot and know several airline pilots. Most of the things that make you feel like you're going to crash in a large jet or turboprop are really not significant. Planes can handle far more turbulence than you'll ever fly through. That sound is probably normal, and an engine failure doesn't mean you're going to fall out of the sky. Go-arounds where the plane aborts its landing happen several times a day at most airports. They're nothing out of the ordinary. Flying on a U.S. airline is one of the safest things you can do. You're more likely to die driving to the airport or even falling out of bed than you are in a large commercial airliner crash. Also, tarmac isn't actually any part of an airport, but rather a material that was used to make airport surfaces decades ago. The runway is where you land and take off, the taxiway is where planes move while communicating with air traffic control, and the ramp or apron is where planes are parked and pushed back. Story 25. I've been looking for an explanation from a pilot regarding the experience I had on an Embraer 145J from Newark to Albany one afternoon. I've been on a lot of flights, especially that little hop, many times. I know what the normal sounds are, including when it sounds like the engine's cut out and it feels like someone hit the brakes. This was different. We took off normally, but about a minute into the climb, the plane went dead silent, and we went into an abrupt nosedive for 3 to 5 seconds, which felt like an eternity. At least 7 people screamed. I clutched my armrest and made peace with the fact that this was finally happening. I always knew I would die in a plane crash. Miraculously, the engine suddenly kicked back in, and we went right back into a sharp climb. 5 seconds later, the exact same thing happened to us again. The plane's engines went silent, and we were pointing straight back at the earth. More people screamed this time, and it was louder than the first time. Again, the engines turned on, and we climbed up to cruising altitude, but the whole flight was shaky. It felt slow. It really felt like we were about to drop out of the sky. There was a woman from Long Island in front of me nervously talking to everybody, saying things like, "My mother would say he's acting like a hotshot." We landed in Albany with no explanation as to what happened. Most pilots I've ever asked shake their heads in confusion, unsure what could have happened. One explanation was that there's a mandatory noise abatement protocol over certain neighborhoods in Newark. Often they'll get clearance to not back the engines off. Possibly in this case, the pilot thought he would get the clearance. Air traffic control said no and made the pilot back off and drop back down to a certain altitude, and they did that in the worst way possible for non-pilot passengers. This sounds like nonsense to me, but it's all I have. This experience traumatized me a little, so a real explanation would be great. Story 26. In 1994, while lining up for final approach to George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston on a sunny and humid 100 FF day, our Boeing 747 hit a large downburst and suddenly dropped 1,000 feet in altitude without warning. All of the passengers were seat-belted in and were completing their U.S. Customs declaration cards. The flight attendants were walking the aisles, making sure that the passengers and aircraft were ready for landing. The sudden drop caused the flight attendants to hit the ceiling. Fortunately, none of them were injured, but the aircraft definitely experienced negative G-forces for a few seconds. Story 27. I'm an airline pilot now, but my first job was flying banners. I have another good banner tow story, but I've told it before. I didn't have passengers, but I had viewers, and from their perspective, nobody noticed anything unusual. One day, as usual, I was given the job of heading to a fairly distant location, unpacking and setting up my banner, picking it up, and flying it. Setup went as it usually does, and I took off to pick the banner up. In banner towing, the way it works is you've got a grappling hook at the end of a cable that's attached to the tail of the aircraft. You take off without the banner attached and come back around, swooping down steeply toward a loop of rope you have set up on the ground, held up between two posts and running down to the banner. At the last second, you yank the plane back skyward, and the hook is supposed to swing between the posts and catch the rope. On my pickup, I felt the satisfying pull of the banner as I leveled off, but something was wrong. It was pulling hard to the left side. A quick look to my left showed that I had missed with the hook and instead caught the banner rope loop with my left main wheel. Even worse, instead of sliding up the gear leg to the fuselage, the rope had caught down near the wheel. I had been provided a steak knife for the purpose of cutting the rope, but there was no way I was going to be able to reach that rope. The plane was yawing hard, but it was under control, and I flew slow circles around the airport while I thought about my options. I could always try to land the plane with the banner attached, but from what I'd heard, that usually results in the plane tipping over onto its nose, ruining the engine and propeller at the very least, and probably causing a lot more damage, not to mention the risk to my own life. I couldn't cut the rope because I didn't have the reach. Then I remembered what I did have, a small toolkit and a roll of duct tape in the pocket behind my seat. I thought about what I could use those for, and it occurred to me that the empty second seat behind me also had a metal tube control stick. Well, it would be worth a shot. I controlled the plane with my knees while I reached behind my seat to get the toolkit. Only a single bolt and nut secure the control stick to the tube below, but I had to access it blindly, reaching below and behind me while also controlling the plane. After a couple of guesses as to which size socket to put on the ratchet, I had a good grip and managed to get the nut off and extract the bolt. A brisk pull-up dislodged the control stick. It was working. The stick was a couple of feet long, and I figured it would be enough to reach out the window and down to the rope. Still flying with my knees, I stuck the steak knife handle into the bottom end of the control stick and wrapped a bunch of duct tape around the joint until I felt it would be secure. It was time to give it a try. Story 28. I was a C-141 navigator for my first Air Force assignment. We were flying a group of families moving back to the U.S. from Japan. As we were on approach at Travis Air Force Base, we had a massive multi-bird strike. It sounded like the world was ending inside the cockpit. It was so loud, we had shattered glass that was coated in blood and feathers, a bent radome, you name it. Flight controls were fine, but we declared an IFE and the co-pilot could see well enough out his window to land. The flight engineer and I were over his shoulder to help spot however we could, and we landed without incident. The passengers deplaned and even complimented us on the great flight. I will never forget the right side of that passenger bus driving away and the look of horror on those people's faces when they saw what the front of that airplane looked like. Story 29. I was a passenger on a flight from Tucson to Phoenix. As we approached the runway in Phoenix, and I mean we were down to the level of the fence, all of a sudden the engines came on at full power and we ascended and flew around to make another landing attempt. The pilot came on and explained that the runway we were going to land on had a plane on it, so he had to abort the landing. Fun stuff. Story 30. Not a pilot, but I was an air traffic controller, and I have a million messed up pilot stories. One somewhat amusing story, yet also very sad, was about a pilot who flew in on emergency fuel in his MiG that he flew around to air shows. He was erratic and didn't listen to instructions well, but he landed safely. He left my airport a few days later and went down in the mountains and was never found. The finding was likely low fuel due to scraping his fuel tanks at an air show prior to arriving at my airport. He never even had it looked at while he was at my airport. He was aware he had scraped his fuel tanks. He came into my airport on emergency fuel, yet pressed on anyway. This is seriously one of the million crazy pilot stories I have. They're just people. They're flawed like the rest of us. Story 31. I wasn't the pilot in this story. I was the clueless passenger. My cousin was a pilot who flew small aircraft like crop dusters and helicopters. He was probably a pretty competent pilot. He spent a lot of time flying over forest fires, running power lines, flying geologists on erupting volcanoes, and removing wounded soldiers from across enemy lines while being shot at. One time, he took me up in his crop duster. It was a little single-seater. I was sitting on the empty chemical tank behind his seat. We were flying over a little town, not sure how high, but not very high, perhaps a couple of thousand feet. I was leaning way over, trying to get a look out the window, when he started looking way left and way right, like he was trying to see the tail end of the plane. He was methodically checking various controls and also appeared to be methodically adjusting the little mechanical trim controls. Finally, he looked back along the inside of the cabin, just under the window, and when he got to where I was leaning out the window, he asked me to move away from the window a bit. After we landed, he pointed out the little rudder control cable, if I recall correctly, that I'd been leaning on pretty hard. He said that he'd been fairly sure that there was some kind of control failure and that he thought we'd possibly be landing fairly hard in a less than optimal place to land. Story 32. Coming in from LAX to Dallas, rough ride, bad storm. The captain comes on and says we'll probably have to divert, but he wants to try something, and we should all buckle up for the fun of it. We dropped what felt like a couple hundred feet, and a crosswind took our left wing up. The whole plane starts screaming, and you can feel the plane moving sideways. About 50 feet from the runway, we literally slide to the next runway over and hit the deck at full speed. We slam on the brakes, and the whole plane lurches and buckles. The pilot comes on the comm. "Whoa-ho, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dallas-Fort Worth. And if you could not tell my bosses I just did that, I would appreciate it oh so very much. Please remain seated." Story 33. About 15 years ago, I was a passenger on a flight that started having bad turbulence. The flight attendants were serving drinks, so they locked up their carts as the pilot told them to sit down. A minute into it, I realized we were also descending very rapidly. I caught a glimpse of the two flight attendants holding hands, and I thought, wow, even they are scared, and it really unsettled me. A minute later, we were still bumping around and descending fast when everyone started gasping and a few people yelled, "Drinks were flying everywhere." I don't know why I had assumed that if we were all about to die, the pilot would make an announcement, and then I realized that they probably wouldn't say anything to keep everyone calm. I looked at the flight attendants again, and they were both sobbing, holding on to each other. I was pretty sure that if they knew we were about to die, obviously we all survived, and I have no clue what was going on, or if we were ever in real danger, but now I search the flight attendants' faces whenever there's any tiny bit of turbulence. Story 34. In January 2007, I was on the passenger manifest for a flight from Mosul, Iraq, Camp Diamondback to Tal Afar. The flight was scheduled to leave at 1 a.m. I arrived just after midnight, and it was raining and pretty windy. About 15 minutes before the flight was supposed to leave, we were told the flight was canceled due to the weather. Since I was stationed at Diamondback, I just went back to my bunk and hit the hay because I was told we would be flying out at 6 a.m. instead. The passenger gathering point, Apex, was right next to the hospital, and as I walked through the hospital on my way to the flight line, a friend of mine came running up to me and threw her arms around my neck, hugged me, and started crying. It turns out the pilots changed their minds about flying, and the UH-60 Blackhawks left at 1:30 a.m. The helicopter had crashed just outside Tal Afar and was still missing at that point. My name was still on the manifest. We found out a few hours later that there were no survivors of the crash. It was an incredibly eerie feeling. I had to email my family and let them know that if anyone showed up to notify them I had been KIA, it was a mistake. I don't know if this belongs under this heading, but it's definitely the scariest flight-related event of my life. Story 35. So I was co-pilot in a Boeing 737-800. We were on short final at Gatwick International, England. Flaps 30 degrees, spoilers or air brakes armed, auto brakes set. Everything was fine until this happened. My captain and I heard the GPWS, a voice in the cockpit to help pilots, saying, "Too low flaps." We were both scared by the voice. The captain put hard pressure on the yoke. That thing used to control the plane, which gave me the priority to fly the plane. But when the priority changed, I was putting flaps lower. The nose went down. When I noticed the plane going down, I immediately grabbed the yoke and pulled the nose up, but the plane was at 400 feet above the ground. Then my captain said, "We might not make it. We are going to stall." Me? What? Engage the auto takeoff and go around. Quick! Captain. Okay. He pressed the button and the thrust lever went up. I told the captain that we could continue our approach as we were at the right altitude again. He agreed, and we landed with no problem. The passengers and the flight attendants didn't notice anything, and we landed smoothly. Clearly buttery. Story 36. I'm an air traffic controller for the record. Had a pilot go Nordo. That's when, for whatever reason, they aren't on my frequency anymore. They didn't get the right one, misheard, or their radios failed. It happens fairly often, and there are a number of things we can do to get you back in the right place. This particular guy, however, went Nordo at precisely the worst time. He was going eastbound, which means he was at an odd altitude. He lost his radio, and his flight plan then had him turn southbound. That means he was supposed to be at an even altitude, which he obviously wasn't. There were about a dozen different planes going northbound that were at his altitude, so he ended up running one heck of a gauntlet through all these people as I was descending and climbing them to get them out of his way. Then, apparently, in an act of sheer ignorance on the pilot's part, he decided to choose an even altitude all by himself, knowing he should probably be at 1. Remember all those planes I had to move out of his way? He managed to put himself right back into them. When you have closure rates of over 1,000 knots, that's not a lot of time to react to those things. At the end, I was so stressed that when I stood up, the seat came with me. Story 37. This was a few months ago. I took a couple of family members up in a 1973 Cessna 172M that I had flown for maybe 6 hours before. I had about 80 hours in a 2006 Cessna 172S as well. When we first got up, there was a little turbulence, but it smoothed out quickly at altitude. I flew over the beach and around the city, then started my descent back into the airport after about an hour. As soon as we started descending, it was apparent that winds had picked up, and it was much more turbulent than when we left, but nothing I hadn't dealt with before. As soon as I got over the end of the runway, I heard the stall warning horn, which means that the airplane's wings are no longer supporting you due to lack of airflow, and started to panic a little when we started sinking maybe 75 feet off the ground. Without missing a beat, I started to go around to retry the landing and almost ran into the same problem on the second attempt, but I just landed a little faster than I normally would. The passengers had no idea anything was wrong until I told them afterwards. Story 38. As a passenger, we were coming into SFO around 10 p.m. after a long flight from Honolulu. We were landing on the cross runway that runs east over the freeway. I'm half asleep, and there are two women in front of me with thick southern accents gabbing away. I feel the back wheels touch the runway, and then there's a huge engine surge as the pilot guns it and heads up and east. The two women in front of me say, "What? I think we just landed on the freeway." After a couple of very quiet and tense moments, the captain comes on and says, "We encountered a little cross traffic, so we're going to try that again." That was all we heard for the rest of the flight. Story 39. I'm on this flight to Copenhagen when the captain announces the start of the landing procedure. You can feel the plane descending until suddenly it goes abruptly back up and starts turning left. We passengers were clueless about what was going on. And then, a confession over the speakers from the pilot. "As you may have noticed, we are going back up. Well, we almost crashed into another airplane. We're waiting for second confirmation from the control tower for landing." Story 40. A few months ago, my boyfriend and I were flying out of Seattle. A few minutes after takeoff, the pilot came on the intercom in a worried tone and warned that there would be extra turbulence and to just stay in our seats buckled up until further instruction. I barely noticed the difference because being on a commercial airline feels like one of the safest places you can be to me. I tend to get cozy and take naps once in the air. My boyfriend, on the other hand, is terrified of flying and is convinced every flight he takes means certain death until proven otherwise. He was a big ball of nerves the whole time and cried that we were going to die. Once we landed, his mom picked us up and told us she couldn't believe that we managed to get out of there. She then continued to show us the news story about a tornado touching down outside Seattle moments after we took off. I guess it was the first tornado to hit Seattle since the 80s, with winds up to 130 mph. I wonder if this was an oh no moment for our pilot. Story 41, February 2017. Flying American Airlines from Miami to Birmingham. We boarded the plane and noticed it was very hot. The air conditioning wasn't working. The attendant said it was, but the air blowing out of the vents was extremely hot. Anyway, we were about 45 minutes into the flight. We're all burning up and sweating profusely. The pilot comes over the speaker and says that we are headed back to Miami, and not to worry, but we've lost cabin pressure. Like I said, we were 45 minutes out from Miami, but it only took us like 20 minutes tops to get back to Miami. I knew things were serious when the attendant was buckling herself in as soon as the pilot made the announcement. It was so hot and hard to breathe. What was even scarier was watching our plane pass the airport to fly over the ocean and dump fuel. I'm assuming that's just in case we land badly. Less chance of exploding. When it came time to land, we were directed to a clear section of the airport. You could see emergency crews lining the runway like they were just waiting to recover bodies. It was the worst landing of my life. I swear we came in so fast we were on two wheels for a few seconds. A friend of mine on the trip with me had never flown before and was nearly in cardiac arrest. I was just dumbfounded that any of this was happening. Anyway, they let us off directly on the runway as quickly as possible. We had to wait 2 hours for a different plane. American Airlines offered us all free beer to make up for the scare, though. Then we had to wait an additional hour because our flight attendant had gotten so freaked out she grabbed her wheeled bag and went home. Story 42. Helicopter pilot here. I was flying a relatively short tour with 3 passengers in an R-44 over some vineyards near the airport I was flying out of. The passengers were all pretty cool and relaxed throughout the flight, so naturally, I was as well. The person up front with me was very interested in what I was doing and how everything worked. He had a million questions, and I was happy to answer them all. Anyway, the tour was almost over, and I was on about a half-mile final when the clutch light turned on. For those not familiar, the clutch light on Robinson helicopters is pretty normal and comes on whenever the clutch is adjusting. Especially in colder climates, it is completely normal to come on for a few seconds and go away, no big deal. However, if it stays on for more than 10 seconds, we're potentially in big trouble. So the clutch light came on while I was mid-sentence, and I subconsciously started counting. Somewhere around 7, I stopped talking and flipped the pilot ISO, practically in denial that this was about to happen. I got to 10, pulled the clutch circuit breaker. At the same time, I felt just the slightest tail shudder, so I pushed for some extra airspeed and mentally prepared to do an auto power-off landing. Luckily, we made it to the ground fine, and I never lost power. After I set it down, the person up front looked at me and said, "What was that all about?" So I just said, "I thought you guys would enjoy a little excitement at the end." They thought it was awesome, so I sent them on their merry way, none the wiser. After they walked away, I opened it up to see only one of the 4 clutch belts still in place. The scariest day that those folks will never know they had. Story 43. I was flying late at night in one of my planes, a small 6-seat propeller aircraft, A-36. I was transporting a group of people from Nantucket to Cape Cod. About halfway through the flight at cruising altitude, several passengers requested a 360-degree turn to get a good view of the stars. Not only was it a cloudless night, but it was also a new moon, so there was zero light pollution. The stars were incredible, and even the Milky Way galaxy was clearly visible. Being at altitude, we had a 360-degree unobstructed view. Even as a pilot, it was one of the most impressive star viewings I've experienced. I reduced power and started a very gentle, slow bank turn. As I was enjoying the view, the engine went from running smoothly to violently shaking the aircraft instantly. I immediately knew something was wrong with one of the cylinders. After inspecting my engine instruments and adjusting the power and mixture settings, I determined that while I still had power, one of my valves was probably failing. My destination airport was the closest option since we were in the middle of Nantucket Sound. I continued at a higher than normal power setting because it seemed to force the failed valve to still function with the extra power. I maintained altitude until I was certain I could make the airport, then went to idle and glided all the way in. Although I was focused intently on my instruments, none of the passengers suspected anything or even noticed the sudden engine change mid-flight. However, the engine sound was questioned once we were on the ground, which I fully explained to them. This unfortunately resulted in around $13,000 worth of engine work, but she's up and running in tip-top shape now. Story 44. When I was learning to fly, there's a stage in your student license where you're awarded a GFPT, General Flying Purpose Test. This allows the student to fly solo or with passengers to the local training area from the aerodrome. So there I was, 16 years old, pimple-faced with no life experience at all, thinking I was the coolest thing around. I was practicing engine failures in a Piper Tomahawk. This is where you start at 3,000 feet, retard the throttle back to idle, and go through a series of steps deciding which field to land in. I went through the process and was on a nice approach to land in some farmer's field when I decided to go around. I applied full throttle at 500 feet to end the exercise, and my seat slid fully aft off the rails. I couldn't reach the yoke or any controls. It was discovered later that the stops that would have prevented the seat from sliding off the rails weren't installed, something that wouldn't have happened if I had set my seat correctly to begin with. So there I was, sitting in a descending aircraft with no control, completely alone. I was desperately wrestling with my seatbelt. The locking mechanism was doing that thing where it tightens every time you try to slowly pull at it. With each attempt, it tightened further. I was now firmly pressed against the seat back. I was down to 100 feet from the ground when I remembered the trim tab. Next to me between the seats was a wheel used to trim the aircraft for different flight profiles. I spun that wheel faster than any DJ has ever spun a turntable. The yoke slowly moved away from the console. I grabbed it with arms fully outstretched and completed the go-around. I was now so close to the ground I could see the cowlick pattern on a grazing cow below me. I climbed slowly back up to the top of the training area and flew straight back to the aerodrome. I can honestly say that incident completely cured my teenage overconfidence. I have another student pilot incident to share if anyone's interested in hearing it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.